And welcome back. So today we are talking about Hope Leslie by Catharine Sedgwick, and this is the first of 3 lectures. Today I'm just going to give you a brief summary of the book without too many spoilers at least. So let's get started. So our story actually starts before the title character, and the book was published in 1827. But it takes place in around the 1610s to the 1640s. So we start a generation before our main characters are born, and then we pick up at about 1630, and then there's a 5-year gap, and we pick up with the characters a little bit later. So William Fletcher, in the beginning of the book, is in love with his cousin Alice. Now, I want to pause for a second here and say that would not have been too unusual at the time. It was pretty common for people in smaller populations to marry their cousins or second cousins, and it's not really clear if they're first or second or third, but they are in some way related. The other thing I want to say is that there are a lot of characters in this book, and I haven't mentioned all of them in this presentation because I did want to do just a brief summary. So I have a reading guide for you with a full list of all of the characters and a little bit of a description about who they are. But the book starts with William Fletcher and his cousin Alice in England, and they are in love. Alice's father encouraged this attachment. Now, that's a phrase that's going to be used a lot. Natural affections and natural attachments. And he encouraged it because he felt like William could be easily controlled. So if William's already his nephew, and if he falls in love with Alice, then Alice's father can get a little bit of control over him, use that natural attachment to his benefit. So he wants William to give up his Puritan beliefs and pledge loyalty to the true church and the king. And at this time, there are a lot of aspects of religion in this that we'll be talking about later. But it's pretty clear that this is the Anglican Church, possibly the Catholic Church even, that they're discussing. So William refuses, and he kind of proves that he's a good Puritan. He and Alice are ripped apart in a very dramatic scene. He's going to the New World in the colonies, and she tries to come with him and is prevented from doing so, and it's too late because he's on the boat and it's set sail. He travels to the colonies. He marries a very good Puritan woman, Martha, and he admires Martha, but they're not really in love, at least not romantic love the way that he loved Alice, and at least not at first. Alice stays in England and eventually marries as well. And Fletcher does quite well in Massachusetts. He settles in the wilderness outside of the town of Springfield. And this is going to be an important plot point later on because he's not in the fortified town with its protections. But he really does this to stay out of town politics. He sees things going on that he does not approve of. And he and Martha have a son, Everil, and several other children, including Everil's sisters and then a small baby. This is a picture of the Pequot War. That's going to be an important plot point in the book. So, word comes to Fletcher. We skip ahead a couple years, and at this point, Everil is about 15. Hope, who is the main character, the book's named after Hope, and she's about Everil's age, so about maybe 13 or 14, maybe a little bit younger than Everil. But word comes to Fletcher that Alice died on her way to the colonies. Her husband had passed away. She was trying to establish herself in the Puritan faith, and she was trying to come to Massachusetts, but died on the way. She left him her 2 children, Alice and Mary. And this is a little bit confusing. These are their names initially, and then their names are changed to Hope and Faith, and it seems to honor her her Puritan faith. Mary being thought of at that point as a little bit more of a Catholic name. So they're renamed Hope and Faith. Fletcher goes to meet them along with their Aunt Grafton, who is kind of a silly woman who just cares about clothes and not as pious as Fletcher or his family. So in his absence, because he's leaving and because he's taking on these two wards, we have Governor Winthrop. And Governor Winthrop sends 2 Native American children as servants. There is a letter from Fletcher about the fact that some of the Native Americans are being used as slaves, and he does not agree with this. So it's pretty clear that they're servants and not slaves, but there's no talk of payment or anything like that. Their names are Magawiska and Oniko. So Magawiska and Oniko, and their mother has just died. Their father, Manonoto, is a feared Pequot chief, and their brother, who would have been the chief, was murdered by the white men, so during this Pequot War. I'm going to talk more about what happened in that war in the next lecture, where we give a little bit of historic background. So Fletcher is gone, getting Hope and Faith, and now the 2 Native American servants have come to live in his house. After Fletcher goes to gather them, he's delayed in Boston. Hope reminds him of Alice, and he enjoys her company, so he keeps her with him as they travel, along with one of their other servants, and sends the rest of the group off to back to his house. So it's a number of weeks that he's gone. In the meantime, Everil has come to admire Magawiska, who tells him stories about the Pequot War. She shares some things about her faith. He thinks that she is very noble and very beautiful. And this causes some distress in Everil's mother, Martha, because she feels that these are natural attachments that should not be encouraged, in part because Magawiska is Native American and not white, but also in part because Magawiska is not a Christian. So she has a lot of worry, and she wants her husband to come home. At the same point, Magawiska is torn between the kindness she has found with the Puritans, particularly her friendship with Everil, and remaining faithful to her family. So she finds out that her father has a plan to rescue her and Oniko and take revenge against the settlers for the death of his other son. And this is somewhat inspired. This picture over here is Pocahontas saving the life of Captain John Smith. So this there's an incident in the book that is inspired by that event. Everil, as I said, has more than a natural affection for her, and his mother is not only worried about this, but also the violence around them. They are alone. She's questioning whether she should go to the fortified part of Springfield and whether her family should move, and ultimately kind of can't make this decision on her own, or at least can't make it in time. So this is a depiction of the events that follow. There's Magawiska right here, again about Everil's age, about 13, 14, maybe a little bit younger than him. Here are the younger children and the baby and Martha, and this is one of the servants who's able to escape. So Magawiska can no longer hold back fate. Her father, Manonoto, comes back to seek revenge. She pleads for him to stop, but her father kills everyone in the Fletcher household. Now, Jeanette, a servant, was hiding. Grafton, Hope and Faith's aunt, had gone out with Digby, another servant. So Everil, whom he plans to kill in revenge for his son, he takes. Faith is also taken because Oniko admires her and kind of loves her a little bit, even though they're a little bit younger. And but everyone else is killed. Martha, the younger children, and the scene is described, especially for that time, in pretty graphic terms. I don't think now we would think about that, but back then it would have been. So in a very stirring scene, Magawiska throws herself in front of Everil. She takes the axe blow meant for him and loses her arm, as Everil is able to escape. Now, all of this really happens at the beginning of the novel, and then we skip ahead 5 years later, and that's where the main part of our story takes place. You'll notice that so far I really haven't talked about Hope that much, and she's the title character, right? So 5 years later, now Everil is about 20, and he's been studying in England. After escaping, they thought that he should go back to England to study. But he and Hope have been writing letters to each other, and he is now returning to Massachusetts. In the meantime, Hope was involved with the escape of a Native American woman who was on trial for witchcraft, named Nelima. And they suspect Hope's involvement, but they can't really prove it. And so it's recommended that she goes to Boston to live with the Winthrops, who we've just heard about, Governor Winthrop. They have a very pious and kind daughter, Esther, who becomes Hope's best friend. And the idea basically is that if Hope goes to live with the Winthrops, she will get a more pious upbringing where she can be controlled perhaps a little bit more, and her natural inclinations toward these Native Americans who she's showing kindness to can kind of be curbed a little bit. When Everil returns, he brings a dapper man with him named Sir Philip Gardner, and then we have some love triangles. So this is a depiction of a Pequot village. Gardner, Everil's friend at first, has his eye set on Hope, but Everil is in love with her as well, and it seems like Gardner's intentions may not be as honorable as they first appear. He dresses too flamboyantly for a Puritan and has this servant with him who is also dressing quite flamboyantly, which they would not have approved of. But he's accepted into their society, and Winthrop decides to talk to Fletcher. He wants to turn the affections of Everil and Hope away from each other. They're really too happy and bright and gay and not so serious and dour and pious as Winthrop and even Fletcher think that they ought to be as good Puritans. They have kind hearts, both of them. But Winthrop feels like if they marry each other, they won't really be helping the church. And according to his Puritan standards, really they're not good for each other. So instead, Everil and Esther knew each other in the past, and Esther fell in love with him so violently that she had a brain fever, which we'll talk about later. Winthrop wants Everil to marry his daughter. He thinks that Esther is kind of the perfect Puritan woman, and that her faith can help Everil come to a better faith. They also kind of want Hope then to go with a better Puritan man, and Gardner, although he is older, seems to be a good match for her. Now, what's interesting about this is that this is essentially what happened to Fletcher before. He was turned away from marrying Alice, but he goes along with this plan nevertheless. Hope is a lot less concerned with love than she is with news from her sister from Magawiska that her sister Faith is still alive. So during this 5 years, Faith has been living with the Pequot tribe, and she has basically assimilated into their tribe, really becoming one of them. Hope has been kind of searching for her, but it's difficult. And there's a lot of tensions with the Native Americans. They don't want to make further trouble and start really a war. They don't want to have Springfield burned or destroyed. So they're kind of trying to leave them alone at various points and be careful about their interactions with them. Still, she's trying to find Faith, who has married Aniko, and again assimilated, really become one of their tribe. By the time they do meet up, Faith does not know how to speak English. So that's kind of how far she has gone in that 5-year period. Adventure. Eventually, as I just said, Hope and Faith are reunited. Faith is really unwilling to come back to Puritan life. She wants to stay with the Native Americans. She's become a Catholic. The idea of putting on the clothes that the Puritans are wearing is really quite abhorrent to her. And she seems to be really in love with her husband. At the same time, Hope kind of realizes her feelings for Everell, but she feels as if she's missed her chance as he's spending more and more time with Esther. And Philip Gardner has tried to win Hope's favor by imprisoning Magawiska for treason. So basically what happens is that Magawiska comes to Hope to tell her where Faith is and to reunite her with her sister. And when that happens, Sir Philip Gardner breaks in with his posse, and they charge Magawiska with treason. And he says it's to win Hope's favor, even though Hope is quite upset by this. It's not really clear. So we have, again, another Native American woman imprisoned for false reasons. And then we discover some of his secrets as well as his true intentions. So why he is doing what he is doing. And I don't want to give away every twist and turn, as it says here. There's shipwrecks, jailbreaks, abduction. There's even some pirates, sort of, to a certain extent. Love triangles, and maybe even quadrangles, if you want to call it that, with 4 people kind of being involved. There's heartbreaks and then endings that are happy for some and despairing for others. But it's a really interesting look at historical fiction written in this romantic tradition, which we're going to talk more about later. And because of that, there's a lot more excitement to this book, I think, than some of the traditional classics that you may have read in the past. So I'm really excited to share it with you. Read-alikes. This book has been compared often to The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper, which also looks at Native Americans and the interactions between Native Americans and the white settlers or the white pioneers. The Scarlet Letter has also been compared to. It's a look back at history written by someone in the 1800s, looking back at the 1600s. I think that you can definitely make some comparisons about their treatments of Puritans, but I also think that I like the Scarlet Letter, but I know a lot of students think that it's kind of boring. But if you liked the Scarlet Letter, then you should like this book too. And if you thought that the Scarlet Letter was boring, then you should maybe like this book more. Dreams and Thunder. So this is a number of stories and poems from a woman named Zikala Sa. She is a Native American author who talked about her experiences. She was born, I think, around 1875, 1876, somewhere around there. And she was a political activist as well as an author. So her work focuses on the struggles with her cultural identity, how she was educated, and she writes, one of her most famous works is called School Days of an Indian Girl, it's quite an interesting book. So if you're interested more in reading Native American literature, this book involves Native Americans, but it is still written by a person who is not Native American themselves, right? But Zikala Sa's work is really interesting. William Bradford of the Plymouth Plantation. Some of this is dull, I have to admit. But if you are interested in history, it's a great look back at what actually happened on the Plymouth plantation, and the descriptions of the first Thanksgiving, what that was actually like. The struggles of having this Puritan community where people from the ship, the sailors, some of whom decided to stay in the colony, and so they had originally thought it was just going to be a Puritan community of pilgrims, and then other people who are not part of their faith are also living there. So it's kind of interesting how they deal with that, and how their relations with the Native Americans as well. Mary Jemison, I hate this picture because Mary Jemison was blonde and I don't like it, but I couldn't find a better book cover. The narrative of the life of Mary Jemison, there's also a children's book by Lois Lenski about Mary Jemison. She was, as it says here, taken by the Indians in the year 1755. So much like Faith, she was captured by the Native Americans and taken to replace really a girl who had been who had also died. So really adopted by a Native American woman to be part of her family. And like Faith, she assimilated to the culture and later on had some opportunities to leave and chose not to. And what happens there is quite fascinating. She acts as interpreter in some situations between the Native Americans and the English. She helps with some of the treaties and other things, and it's a very interesting story of her life. So if you really like that aspect of this book, that's a fascinating book to read. Uncle Tom's Cabin we're going to read later, but it is similar romantic tradition. It's a little bit more sentimentalist, but we'll talk about some of those differences as we get to them. The Witch of Blackbird Pond is about a Puritan community, and it is a young adult novel. So it's historical fiction. It takes a few liberties, but it's kind of interesting nonetheless. And then lastly, the poetry of Anne Bradstreet. Anne Bradstreet was a Puritan woman who wrote beautiful poetry. And if you're interested in the Puritan life as it was actually lived, as opposed to the stereotypes that we have of it, reading about her and her life and reading some of her poems can help kind of fill in those gaps for you. So those are some of my recommendations, some newer ones, some older ones, and that's it for today. I almost said our next episode. The next lecture is going to focus on some more aspects of the novel, and we'll be talking about some of the historical background and a few of the themes. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.